So my name's Rene. It's a French name, but I'm actually Dutch by birth, so I don't know why I've got a nice exotic French name. Sounds better. I'm not Tasmanian, so I know it's pretty bad, but I'm married to one, so that's half good, isn't it? So that's not so bad. But I don't work for Primary Health, so I've been engaged by Primary Health as an expert in the tendering and contracts and procurement field to run these workshops. So I run my own business, consulting and training throughout Australia and overseas. So what I'll do is just give you a bit of an overview why we've decided to run these presentations. So basically, Primary Health has realised that there are a lot of smaller organisations, of course, throughout Tasmania. Some of you have complete knowledge of how the process works, and some of you find it a bit more difficult. So recognising that, of course, Primary Health has decided to run the workshops to make you familiar with it. So hopefully by the end of today, you will have a pretty good understanding of how everything works and what you need to do in that process. The thing that I want to point out is that our discussions will be generic in nature, so not on specific tenders. The only thing I will do is look at the current tender on the Tenderlink website, so we can go through, as an example, the sort of documents to look at, the process to follow, and all of that sort of thing. But obviously, we're not going to necessarily answer specific questions on this current tender. Bit of an overview. So first of all, who is Primary Health Tasmania? And it's surprising, actually, that a lot of people don't know. We had a lot of people over the last few days think that Primary Health is a government entity, and they are not. So I'll tell you who they are in a moment. The PHT procurement and tendering framework, and so how does that work, and what's the process essentially behind that? What are tenders? Why are they used, and why not something else? And so I'm going to tell you all about those and the different types of tenders, different types of procurement that they might use. The roles and relationships internally. So who does what? How do I figure out what happens? Understanding Tenderlink, and that's where we'll go live to the web, and up on the screen we'll go live to the website, and I'll take you through that step by step. And again, feel free to ask as many questions as you need to. Understanding the key terms and the core requirements of the tenders is something we'll look at as well. So I'm going to take you through all the documents that are in this current tender, so you can see, well, what do they all mean, what's important about them, and so on. Looking at the rights and obligations of both parties, so PHT as well as you as a provider, so what does each party play, what role do they play? Once I've uploaded my tender response, then what? And so I'm going to go through about the process of assessment, as it says there as well, and what actually happens to your particular submission, and then the outcomes that come out of that. And finally, we'll talk about the tender award and contracting process, so a little bit about that as well. So again, feel free to ask questions as we go through. As I said, I will be repeating your question, and then I'll try and give you an answer. If I can't give you an answer, I'm not going to make it up. So we'll take questions on notice. We do have Julia here that can answer some specific questions, but hopefully we'll get through that okay. So Primary Health Tasmania is a not-for-profit, fully Commonwealth government funded organisation, and of course they in turn try and fund other organisations like yourselves to carry out a number of functions. Their whole idea is to make sure that Tasmanians keep well and out of hospital, so it's about interventions that happen before they get to that stage. A couple of main objectives: to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of medical services for patients, and of course the whole goal is about that, to maximise your bang for your buck. How far will this funding go, of course, is very important. And of course, the outcomes that are received all make sense as well. Also, improving coordination of care, and it's about the right care in the right place at the right time. So, the assessment process, of course, for tenders is to maximise that where possible. So let me talk a bit about what a tender is. A tender is designed to elicit responses from the open market generally. So I want to talk about a few different types of tenders that you might see or other ways of accessing the market. For PHT, what it actually means is that anything over a value or perceived value of over $100,000 must go through a tender process. So they've got their own procurement framework, but because they are funded by the Commonwealth Government, they also have to meet Commonwealth Government guidelines. All right. So does anybody here do work for Tasmanian Government? Yeah. So you'll know that that figure is actually $250,000 for the Tasmanian Government. So can anybody tell me, well, what happens below $100,000 then? Anybody have an idea? Not sure? Basically, below $100,000 is where PHT can go to the market and seek 3 quotations, all right? Or more, of course, but at least 3. It means that they don't have to go to the tender process. So what we are focusing on today is that whole tender process, it's also their preferred way of doing things. PHT, for some time now, have used Tenderlink to manage the process, and some of you have been dealing with primary health or its forerunner Medicare Local will know that things might have been different in the past. So the whole idea about today is to understand how Tenderlink works, what do I need to do, and all of that sort of thing. And again, stop me anytime if you've got a question. One particular way that they can access the market is to go for an expression of interest, or EOI. What does that mean? So why that and why not a tender, for example? And the reason for an EOI is normally where there are some unknowns. For example, not really sure who's out there that can provide the service, and therefore by going through an expression of interest, we get people out of the woodwork coming and saying, yes, we can do it. The main reason probably though is that we are seeking a solution to a problem, but they can't really define exactly how that solution should work. So we let the market tell us. The normal process from an expression of interest is to shortlist down and then invite further tenders from that shortlisted list of providers. So a tender is still the end result normally, unless there's only one possible solution, but normally further tenders are then invited. So the key thing about why a tender is we know exactly what we want, and therefore you need to comply with our tender document if you can provide this service and so on. Yep, question? Yeah, so the question is the expression of interest, is it duplicating some of the other things that might happen, or is it specific to a particular requirement? Does that sound about right? Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I mean the expression of interest is for a particular requirement, and as part of that might well be consultations and further discussions to then really get to the bottom of, you know, well, how should we be going to the market with something specific? Yeah. Is that okay? Yes. All right. The other thing that they do is they go to tender, and there's 2 different types of tenders. One is a limited tender, and in a limited tender, they are seeking tenders only from selected organisations. Why might they do that? Basically because their market research and so on tells them that the open process doesn't make sense. For example, the other day we had somebody from Sheffield, little town up north of course, and so if we wanted some work done in Sheffield only, and there are only 3 providers, then a tender to those 3 providers might make sense, rather than the whole open market. But it's pretty rare. Most of the time we want to go to the open market, and it can be advertised in newspapers and on Tenderlink as well. Now, advertising in newspapers is on its way out, to be honest with you. It's expensive. Most jurisdictions have gone away from that, and therefore they're usually all electronic. Tasmanian Government, for example, most tenders would be on their own tender portal. The other thing to remember is that the tender process can actually be quite expensive. If you think about number of people involved, time involved, etc. When I was in Queensland a few